Ever since the 2008 release of Iron Man, starring Robert Downey Jr., the Marvel Cinematic Universe has captivated millions of audiences. Many fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe were in tears when Tony Stark, aka Iron Man, passed away in Avengers Endgame, despite the studio continuing to produce amazing movies and television shows and satisfy fans. Since the movie's release, many people have desired that RDJ's character could have lived to save the world, but alas, it was not feasible. In fact, a theory that we recently came across claims that surrounding two major breakpoints, one is based on the absolute point concept which was introduced during the What If series, and the other is that Kang, the current MCU villain, rather than Thanos, is to blame for Iron Man's demise in every timeline and world. So let's examine the theory in more detail. The MCU has always been anchored by Tony Stark, who often serves as the face of the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe. Tony Stark, who has been a superhero for one of the longest 10 years, has encountered death several times, both in the regular MCU chronology, and in the various alternate timelines we have seen, thanks to the What If series. In the What If series, several deaths of Tony Stark have caused many fans to assume that his passing is an event that is regarded as an absolute point in time, despite the fact that Stark did ultimately meet his end in Avengers Endgame. Is Tony's passing a solid argument? Before we begin, a little warning. For this video, we will be proposing both sets of evidence as to why it may be, and why it might not be. We are simply here to provide objective stances, but we'll leave the final decision up to you as the viewer. You must decide whether Tony's death is actually an absolute point. We are merely giving both sides of the theory. First, we have to discuss what an absolute point is, and let's clear up some confusion about the prospect of an absolute point in time, and cover the two main explanations as to what exactly this means. In episode 4 of the What If series, we are introduced to the concept of an absolute point via the death of Christine Palmer, thus setting in motion the alternate Doctor Strange's downfall. However, based on the research and evidence, option 1 proposes that the death of Christine was not the absolute event that cannot be changed, as the episode itself seems to indicate. The loss of what Strange loved the most is the real issue at hand. Given that he developed a considerably closer bond with Christine in this version than he did in the MCU's regular timeline, this loss appears in Christine's death. Doctor Strange likes his job and his way of life more than Christine in the main timeline. So, this is what he will ultimately lose on that terrible day. The loss of his hands prevents Doctor Strange from continuing his surgical practice, and he is doomed to lose the things he values most in life: his fortune, celebrity status, and way of life. Since this is a constant throughout all worlds, he will inevitably lose the object to which he clings his identity in order to mature as a person. This refers to Christine in What If Episode 4, and in the MCU's standard timeline, it refers to his job and his surgical skills. According to the second view, each branch has its own set of absolute points that do not overlap with others, and that are unique to its own universe. Since Marvel has not yet officially said which of these two readings is the true one, it's vital to keep both in mind while we investigate this option. The outcome is the same for each of these occurrences. We are aware that there are numerous ways in which absolute points might occur, as demonstrated by Doctor Strange's introduction to magic, and ascent to the position of Sorcerer Supreme, as well as his loss of the things he loves. I know it feels like entering into a deep hole, and started to ask where is Iron Man in all this, but please, bear with me. We know that Christine Palmer's death takes on multiple forms, and so it stands to reason that Tony Stark may as well, and it seems as if death has been chasing Stark since the beginning in all of the multiverses. All the way back to the first Iron Man, the fallout of his battle with the Ironmonger seems to hint at the idea that Tony's arc reactor is failing, and that he may very well die in the closing minutes of the movie. This of course though does not happen, and Tony survives, but it is a precedent that carries forward throughout the MCU. He nearly dies upon destroying the Chitauri army, and falling back down to Earth, as well as in Age of Ultron when he destroys the Sokovian meteor. In Infinity War, he seems close to meeting his ends at the hand of Thanos on Titan, and perhaps his closest near-death experience until his actual demise in Endgame. According to this well-known fan theory, Tony Stark's early demise is an absolute point that has been pursuing him for years, and will eventually catch up to him before he is blessed with the power to live a long life, and pass away naturally. In essence, Tony Stark is destined to die. Tony Stark has just been fortunate enough that death doesn't catch up with him until Endgame, or rather that the TVA has determined it to be so, as we see numerous occasions in the What If series where this inevitable event catches up to him earlier than an Endgame. He is seen being killed by Eric Killmonger, assassinated by Hank Pym, and infected by the zombie virus. If Tony Stark is being pursued by death, then his untimely death might be an absolute moment in time, albeit it might take different shapes depending on the timeline he is currently in. Now, let's address some of the flaws with this theory, and see if it still holds up to scrutiny. But like we said, we will leave the final verdict up to you, the viewer. The first flaw is that Christine Palmer's resurrection was prohibited by the fact that it was paradoxical. If Doctor Strange stops this moment, then he never becomes the Sorcerer Supreme. As a result, he cannot resurrect her, the loop restarts, and reality itself is torn apart. It is implied that one reason this event is an absolute point is that it would result in a cosmic paradox, even though it is quite plausible that absolute points can be non-paradoxical. Although it's still to be seen, there is no proof that Tony Stark's survival past Endgame results in a comparable conundrum. Given the multiversal arc's potential, it is quite likely that at some point in the near future, Kang or one of his versions will explain why Tony Stark had to die within a specific amount of time, and could not be permitted to continue living after a particular point in history. The other main point of contention is that an absolute point seems to need to result in a certain outcome with Doctor Strange. Both of his absolute points result in him becoming a sorcerer, whether it is because he loses his hands, like in our timeline, or if it's the form of losing Christine, like he did in the What If episode. Tony Stark's deaths throughout the What If series seems to have nothing in common, so far as we can tell. But again, it is possible that this result will be revealed in the history of the multiversal saga, in order for this theory to make airtight sense. There has to be a reason why Tony Stark absolutely cannot be allowed to live beyond a certain landmark time on the timeline. A direct result that somehow impacts the future of the MCU timeline. Perhaps it is an invention that Tony is destined to discover that cannot come to life, or his death motivates a particular individual to take a particular course of action. We know that this individual cannot be Morgan, as she isn't born in most of the realities. However, it might hypothetically push characters like Pepper Potts or Happy Hogan to choose a course of action that has already been decided upon in terms of the timeline. But once again, it is still unclear what direct effects Tony Stark's passing might have on the multiversal narrative. Therefore, the main flaw with this theory and the primary evidence as to why it can't work, could very well be rectified in the near future. Meaning that, this flaw might be living on borrowed time. Meaning that, Tony Stark's death is in fact, an absolute point in time, and that he is destined to give his life or be killed somewhere all along the multiverse. He doesn't continue to exist after Avengers Endgame for whatever reason, but it's unclear why at this point. Anyway, what do you think of the idea, my friends? Do you consider Tony Stark's untimely passing to be a precise moment in history? If so, why do you believe that is? Do you think there will ever be a world where Tony Stark is allowed to retire, live a long life, and eventually pass away from natural causes if you don't think his death was an absolute point? Please share your opinions about this theory in the comments section below. Also, my dear friends, click the subscribe button to join our squad, and have a wonderful day.